This is probably one of the sort of reasons we're all here. The fact that, especially in the United States now, there has been a decline in democracy. What this graph is showing, and I find it quite interesting, is that when you align episodes of democratic backsliding on their time of origin, and you compare what happened in Hungary, Russia, and Turkey to what is happening to the United States, then what you see is that it is far faster in the US now than it was in those other autocratizing countries, and we have no idea where that red line is going to go. Now, democratic backsliding almost invariably is accompanied by violence. In the US, hate crimes have doubled over the 10 years between 2015 and 2024. And of course, whenever violence, hate crimes arise, it is very often attributed to internet radicalization, the rhetoric on social media, and so on. And the question I want to address today is whether there is a path from rhetoric to violence. Does online rhetoric predict political violence? Now, this is not an easy question to answer, I don't think. Here are two elements, two quotations. The first one about Alabama being full of vicious racists and so on. The other one about the left having diversified the world and leaving it as a shithole to the poor young people now. And you look at those, and maybe it's not easy to differentiate between those two pieces of rhetoric. Now, it might help if I point out that the first one is a quote of a speech given by Martin Luther King, whereas the second one is an excerpt of a post by somebody whom I would characterize as an anti-Semitic and misogynistic political operative. Now, how then can you go and can you sketch out this path from rhetoric to violence? What is it that we need in order to draw this connection? Well, I think what we need for starters is we need to have a toolbox of identifiable aspects of political rhetoric that could potentially be used to predict violence. We then need to somehow have a benchmark, texts that we know are linked to violence, that gave rise to violence or were associated with violence. Now, if we start with that, and we can predict violence on the basis of that taxonomy, well, great, then we've sort of established predictability. But what I think we also need, we also want, is to have a theoretically grounded analysis of means of persuasion that people may engage in to create and to stimulate violence. And ideally, we want this to be politically neutral, topic unaware. We need some sort of modeling tool to make this happen. And I wouldn't be here if we didn't have something that fulfills these requirements. A brief overview of what we have. We have classifiers developed by Google Jigsaw that are identifying rhetorical techniques. We have political manifestos that we linked to violence or being benign over a 200-year period. And we have human ratings of Reddit comments, contemporary Reddit comments, that were rated according to their use of persuasive techniques. So let me go through the steps here to explain how this works. These are the rhetorical techniques for which we have machine classifiers. The first one is known to be relevant for democratic deliberation, reasoning. Yeah, of course it is. That's what democracy is about. The others are frequently seen as being manipulative or deceptive. And just to illustrate what I mean by that, Alienation, which will turn out to be one of the important ones, relates to creating an out group, sort of saying, you are not part of me, you're not who you think you are, as in this particular example. So that was the first component. The second component is that we have human raters looking at 5,000 or 6,000 Reddit comments, identifying whether the technique being used in these comments are deliberative persuasion, strategic persuasion, or manipulation. Now, the top two, again, are legitimate techniques by which we try to persuade each other in a democracy. The third one, manipulation, is commonly seen as being unacceptable. Here is one example of a manipulative comment. Oh, after all I've done for you, you can imagine how that might go over. And finally, we have measures of real-world violent outcomes, manifestos over the last 200 years, where by agreement between raters and the historical record and sources such as Wikipedia, we were able to establish quite well whether a manifesto led to violence or not. An example of a non-violent manifesto is Simón Bolívar's Cartagena Manifesto. I don't know what that is, but it's a very important historical manifesto that was benign. On the other hand, the Black Panthers' 10-point program from the 1960s was judged to be associated with violence. All right, so now we have the toolbox. Next thing we need is the models to put all this together and to predict excuse me, what's going on. Now, we start out with classifiers that were developed by Google, Jigsaw. They were pre-trained on a huge set of corpora of text, and basically they're kind of feature detectors that already exist, and if you throw them at text, then they fire depending on what technique is present in the text. So our first models dealt with predicting real-world violence from those rhetorical techniques, starting out with just using the existing classifiers on their own. So each of these feature detectors, we looked at how well that could predict whether or not a manifesto was violent, and we found that, yeah, they work pretty well. Alienation, the out-group creation, is the biggest predictor on its own, and it performs quite well. These numbers are, to put them in context, chance is shown in blue. Anything above that is good, and in fact, if you know anything about these measures, like an AUC curve, basically it's damn good. Okay, that's the technical summary of that result. Now, if we then create a model in which we're actually teaching those classifiers to predict the outcome, then we have similar positive results. Yes, we can do this, and we have taken a step here because instead of applying the classifier to all the manifestos at the same time, here we're teaching the model on 80% of the manifestos and test on a holdout set of the other 20%. And that is a far stronger test of the model's ability, and we now can conclude, yes, we can predict violence based on these feature detectors alone. But now, what we really want to know is, can we also model the persuasive techniques that people engage in? And if so, can we then use those to predict violence? So not just the surface rhetoric, but the deep persuasive intent. So here's our third model, again taking our feature detectors, but now applying it not to the manifestos, but to a corpus of Reddit comments in political Reddits, and with the ground truth being our participants' ratings of whether the comment was manipulative or strategic or deliberative. And as I mentioned before, the manipulation is typically considered to be, less moral than the other two means of persuasion. And here's what we find. We find that among the top two predictors, we again have alienation, and then we have reasoning. And what is interesting, if we just consider alienation, is how the direction of the relationship changes. The more alienation, the more manipulation. That seems to be an aspect of what people judge to be manipulative rhetoric. The reverse is true for deliberative. The more deliberative you are in your persuasion attempts, the less alienating rhetoric you're using. And conversely, you get the reversal for reasoning. The more reasoning, the less manipulative, but the more deliberative. So this tells us something about how the textual features relate to the deep structure of attempts to persuade people by argument. Now we have one more step to take. Now what we want to do is we want to take that model, which tells us what persuasive technique is being used, and we want to see if we can predict violence. Now, to do so, we stop learning. We lock these weights after they have been trained on the Reddit comments. And we're now saying, let's just apply the output to the manifestos. Can we now predict violence in the manifestos without further learning? Now, there is a thresholding process involved in there, which I'm going to skip over because I only have 1 minute and 18 seconds left. So let me go straight to the data, and again, telling you what chance is up here. You take one look, or maybe two looks, at these numbers, and they're far in excess of chance in all cases. What are the different rows here? At the very bottom is the manifesto model that I already showed you. That was our model 2 from the beginning. That's going straight to the manifestos. The top 3 rows are telling us, or were estimated using persuasion, not the manifestos. But then when you take it from persuasion to the manifestos without further learning, you get performance that is pretty much the same. In other words, we can predict violence in the real world on the basis of how people judge the persuasive techniques being applied in contemporary Reddit comments. And just to illustrate how well this works, I showed you a bunch of numbers. What I'm showing you here now is a visual representation. The red manifestos are violent, the blue ones are benign, and if you just take one look, you'll see that the red is pretty much on the top right, the blue pretty much on the bottom left, and the differentiation is very good. And that's taking our 2 best models together, showing that we can predict violence from rhetoric quite well. And for me, the important aspect of this is that we can do it from social media data. We can go from social media data to predicting violence, suggesting that the way in which people argue on social media has echoes, or might have echoes, in real world violence. And with that I'll conclude. There was supposed to be a QR code there. That's gone. And, oh, because no one has a camera. Right. Duh. Okay. Well, if you'd seen the QR code here, it would have pointed to the Anti-Autocracy Handbook, which some of us published last year, which deals with this whole idea we're confronting now of democratic backsliding. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll reissue the links to the papers later. So, questions? We have a few minutes. Yes, over here.
Hi, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, I can see you now.
I have a question about how you defined, I guess, political violence. Because I do think that matters, because you were bringing in so many different manifestos that I don't think are quite neutral, because some, like you mentioned, were fighting against, the Spanish colonization, the fight against racial oppression. So there's, I think, a very... And then when you were speaking, you were talking often about violence rather than political violence. And I think there's a difference between political violence, state violence. And so I would just love for you could talk a bit more about.
Yeah, no, it's a great question. And yes, I said violence because it's shorter, rather than political violence. But what the whole project was about is political violence. It's not about interpersonal violence between individuals, but politically motivated violence. Now, to your point about the manifestos being very diverse, absolutely. They were about as diverse as we could. I mean, we tried hard to make them diverse, because what we were trying to do is to identify invariant features in argumentation that will tell us whether a text is being used by the author or by others in unleashing politically motivated violence. So I see the diversity as a strength, not a problem.
Francine, up front.
Hi, I'm very interested in the persuasion step, because in the United States there's some perception that the violence is coming from pre-existing groups that already had a preset bigotry, racism, misogyny, et cetera, and the current political environment is giving permission to that. So the question is did you or can you look at modes of persuasion or modes of communication, length of time it takes, or something to say, how do you turn potentially pre-existing feelings into a permission structure that results in physical violence?
Okay, now again, that's a great question. Basically, we never looked at the individual level. We never investigated how does person X become motivated to go out in the street and storm the Capitol or whatever it is. We never did it at that level. We just looked at it at the level of the text that was a catalyst for violence or not, right? Our manifestos went both ways. So we can't answer the individual level analysis. And as far as what you're asking about how the persuasion takes place, well, I don't have time to explain it in great detail, but we basically looked at these 3 different forms of persuasive argumentation that we synthesized from the, sort of psychological and philosophical literature, trying to identify major streams of how you can do that. Deliberative, strategic, and manipulative. And we then explained that to our participants. We said, okay, this is what we mean by manipulative. So that means you're being deceptive. You're trying to sort of, sway people without argument, simply by inventing stuff or whatever. And then we had similar instructions for the other 2 types of persuasion. And we find that people are very good at looking at text and identifying how that text is trying to persuade the reader. And so we have these statistics on inter-rater reliability and all that stuff. And it's, it looks really good statistically. And then we find that we can predict it on the basis of our classifiers. And that once we do that, bang, we get can classify the manifestos, whether they're violent or not. Now, what we don't have is the step from the Reddit comments to an individual reading them who might then commit violence. That we don't have. And I'm not sure how you would even get there. I mean, you'd have to know the reading patterns of people who stormed the Capitol, for example, and then compare it to others who don't. I mean, it's basically, you can't do it, I don't think.
Let's go to Michael. So 2 more questions.
Thanks. Great presentation, Steve.
Thanks, Mike.
So I wanted to ask you about, there seems to be sort of an implicit assumption of stationarity here. I mean, when, 2-century-old manifestos, the stationarity of the relationship between rhetoric and violence. Can you talk about that?
Yeah, excellent question. We did the analysis over the decades or whatever, and the predictability, the take-home message is it gets stronger as you come closer to the present. But it's not that it is absent in the 19th century. So there seems to be something about manipulativeness as opposed to deliberation that is seeding violence. Now, there's one other thing I want to add, which wasn't your question, but it's, I think, very interesting information. The distribution of the presence of these techniques within the text matters. We analyzed this at the level of each paragraph. And it turns out that even manifestos that lead to violence have some passages that are high in deliberative persuasion. But they have a hell of a lot more that are manipulative. And it is the probabilistic mixture that is another fingerprint of violence. Whereas benign manifestos have less manipulation, but they may also have less persuasion. But it's the lopsided distribution of just a little bit of deliberation thrown in with a lot of alienation. That seems to be the underlying driver.
Okay, one more question.
Thank you. Thank you for this presentation. Joël Rusk, International Committee of the Red Cross. I'm going to ask 2 questions in one, if that's okay. First, you're talking about predictability of violence in relation to rhetoric. One challenge that we face at the International Committee of the Red Cross is proving causality between harm, especially in times of armed conflict, in relation to information, rhetoric, narratives that have preceded acts of violence in communities, especially in situations where you have, for example, civilians acting in armed violence against other civilians. And the second question in relation to that causality, what are your thoughts on proving that causality, if at all? We failed to do that after a lot of research. The second question in relation to that is that predictability and the likelihood of violence occurring as a result of rhetoric. Can it actually be automated to create early warning systems?
Yeah, great questions. The second one is the easier one. I hope so. Yes, in principle, you could run this at scale and you can pick out things on Reddit. Whoa, this is kind of risky. Yes, can be done. The causality question is more complicated, more interesting, but it is not impossible to resolve. Let me give you one example, or if I have time, I can give you more, but I'll start with one. One example, okay, but it's a good one. The genocide in Rwanda. You can causally link that to that radio station that was telling people to kill their neighbors, whatever, RTM or whatever it was called. Thank you. How do you know that? Well, you know that, no, sorry, not how do I know? How do I know that there's a causal link? You can look at the topography of the country and you can identify the signal strength from the transmitter in different villages that are scattered at random throughout the country. And villages behind a hill where the radio couldn't get to had a lower incidence of violence than identical villages that were just by chance higher up on the ridge and got a stronger radio signal. So you can plot the murder rate as a function of strength of the signal in that radio based on topography. Now, to me, that's not a correlation. That's a causation. And there's lots of other examples like that. You can do a lot of stuff with signal strength. World War II propaganda in Germany, AfD voting in East Germany now is a function of how much Western TV they had before unification. There's a lot of causal evidence that you can do through fancy statistics, but it can be done.
Okay, thank you, Stephan.